Every morning for 6 months, Abena Kwarteng had driven past the cemetery on her way to work. Not because it was the fastest route, it was not, but because the longest route was the only one that made the morning feel like something she was moving through instead of something that was happening to her. The cemetery was on Peach Street in Marietta, Georgia, and she had never gone in. She had not been at the burial. She had not been at the gravesite. She had not been permitted to say goodbye to her husband of 16 years at the cemetery on Peach Street, because his family had told the funeral home, clearly and in writing, that Abena was not to be admitted to any portion of the services. She had driven past that cemetery every morning for 6 months because it was the closest she had been allowed to get. Joseph Kwarteng had died on a Tuesday evening in March 2023, a cardiac event at 51 years old, the kind that arrives without warning in the specific way that certain deaths arrive. Ordinary Tuesday. Dinner on the stove, a man sitting down and not getting back up. Abena had been the one to call the ambulance. She had ridden with him to the hospital. She had been with him when the doctors said there was nothing more they could do. She had called Joseph's mother, Adwoa, from the hospital waiting room at 9:47 p.m. and said, "He is gone." What happened in the 48 hours after that phone call was the thing Abena had been trying to find the right words for in 6 months of morning drives. Adwoa had arrived at the hospital within an hour. Joseph's brother Emmanuel had arrived shortly after. There had been, in those first hours, the specific suspended reality of a family in acute grief. People crying, people holding each other, and Abena moving through it the way a wife moves through the first hours of her husband's death, which is to say, not quite in her body yet, present but not yet arrived at the full weight of what had happened. By the following morning, something had shifted. Joseph's family had taken over the arrangements entirely, not in the way that families sometimes rally, warmly, collaboratively, sharing the weight, but in the specific way that felt, from Abena's side of the table, like a boundary being drawn. Adwoa had spoken to the funeral home. Emmanuel had handled the death certificate administrative questions. Abena had been present for none of it. When she had tried to join a call with the funeral director, Emmanuel had said, "We will handle it." She had accepted that the first day. Grief makes people accept things. On the second day, she had been told that the viewing would be family only, and that the family had decided to follow traditional Ghanaian burial customs, which the family was organizing through their church, and that the service would be conducted in a way that honored those customs. And that Abena, who was Jamaican, who had joined the Kwarteng family at 28, who had been Joseph's wife for 16 years, was not, in the family's determination, the right person to be leading any portion of the public mourning. She had not been told she was excluded. She had been managed out incrementally in the specific way that people who have decided something manage other people when they are not ready to say the decision out loud. The letter had come on the 4th day. From an attorney, not a personal letter, not a family member on the phone. An attorney on letterhead, stating that the Kwarteng family would be conducting a private family service, and that Abena's presence had not been requested and would not be appropriate given certain ongoing matters related to the estate. She had not known there were ongoing matters related to the estate. She had attended none of it. She had sat in her house on the day of the funeral, the house she and Joseph had bought together in 2014, the house that was in both their names, the house where their shared life had happened. And she had played a recording of the hymn Joseph had loved most. And she had sat at the kitchen table, and she had said goodbye in the way of a person who has been told there is no seat for her in the official ceremony. 2 days after the funeral, Adwoa had called and asked for $14,000. The money, she said, was needed to cover the cost of the funeral and the traditional customs and the church contribution. She said it was expected that the wife would contribute. She said it was what Joseph would have wanted. Abina had been quiet on the phone for a long time. Then she had said, "I will have to think about that." She had hung up. She had not called back. Nobody in that studio knew that the woman at the first podium had been barred from her husband's funeral and asked for money 48 hours later. She had come to Family Feud because her best friend from work, a woman named Cecilia, had booked the team months before Joseph died. It had been a fun project, a thing to look forward to. One of those plans that life makes ordinary and then extraordinary by what arrives between the booking and the taping. Cecilia had offered to cancel. Abina had said no. She had said, "I need to be somewhere that requires me to show up as a person, not a grieving widow being managed." Cecilia had said, "All right then, let's go." The team was Cecilia, Abina's sister Naomi, Naomi's husband Frederick, and a woman from their church named Pearl, who had, on the day of the funeral, driven to Abina's house uninvited and sat with her for the entire day, and not said a word that wasn't necessary, and every word that was. Steve Harvey got to Abina during the intro and asked what she did. Hospital administrator, 19 years. He asked what the hardest part of hospital administration was. She said, "Keeping people in the room who belong there, and knowing the difference between the people who belong and the people who are just claiming the space." Steve stopped. "That sounds like it has a specific meaning today," he said. She looked at Cecilia. Cecilia gave her the nod. And Abina Kwarteng told Steve Harvey about the Tuesday evening and the hospital waiting room, and the attorney's letter, and the day of the funeral, and the kitchen table, and the hymn played alone. She told him about the $14,000 request 48 hours later. She told it with the precision of a hospital administrator, dates, sequences, specific facts, and without any excess. Because she had been living inside this story for 6 months and had stripped it down to what it actually was. A woman who had been removed from the last moments of her husband's life by the people who had decided they had more claim to him in death than she did. She said, "I drove past the cemetery this morning. I've driven past it every morning for 6 months. I have not gone in." The studio fell completely silent. Steve Harvey had not moved. He stood at the podium and looked at Abina and was quiet for a long moment. "You drove past the cemetery this morning," he said. "Yes." "Every morning for 6 months." "Yes." "And you haven't gone in." She looked at him. She said, "Not yet. I'm not ready, but I'm getting there." 300 people stayed completely still. Not the usual game show pause. A different kind of silence. The kind that forms around something that has been carried a long distance, but that had finally set down in a room large enough to hold it. Steve pressed his handkerchief to his face. He turned away from the cameras. He stood with his back to the audience for a full 10 seconds. A crew member near the production board had stopped entirely. Pearl, on the family side, had her hands clasped and her eyes closed. When Steve turned back, he was composed but operating in a different register. "Let me tell you something," he said. He walked forward from the podium slowly. "I made a promise. A real one to God when I had nothing, when I was in my car, when I didn't know if I was going to make it. I promised that if he got me out, I would spend the rest of my life showing up for people who had been told there was no seat for them. Because I know what it is to be told there's no seat. I know what it is to be the person who doesn't get to be in the room." He looked at Abina. "You were Joseph's wife for 16 years. You called the ambulance. You rode with him. You were there when they said there was nothing more they could do. And then someone sent an attorney's letter. He stopped. He breathed. That attorney's letter does not change who you were to him. It does not change 16 years. It does not change the Tuesday evening or the kitchen table or the hymn. And I need you to know that in this room, in front of these people, there is a seat for you. There has always been a seat for you. Stop everything, Steve said. He was already moving. We are stopping the game. This has never happened in the 45-year history of this show. He walked Abina to the front of the stage. He sat beside her on the steps and held the microphone and said, "What do you need to be able to walk through those cemetery gates?" She thought for a long time. She said, "I need to know that the decision I made to stay out of the fight, to not respond to the attorney, to not respond to the money request, to not go to court immediately, I need to know that was dignity and not defeat." Steve said, "It was dignity. I'm telling you right now." He held up his hand. He pulled out his phone. He called an estate and probate attorney his foundation worked with, live on speaker, the entire room hearing every word. He explained the situation in 5 sentences. 16-year marriage, joint property, funeral exclusion, estate attorney's letter, $14,000 request. The attorney said, "Mrs. Kwarteng has significant legal standing as a surviving spouse." She said, "The estate cannot be administered without her participation, and what was described as traditional custom does not override marital property law." She said, "I want to speak with her today." Steve confirmed the consultation and covered all legal costs through his foundation. But Steve wasn't done. He held up his hand. There was more. He called a grief and trauma counselor, 2 minutes, live, speaker on, and arranged sessions specifically for traumatic funeral exclusion and spousal grief complicated by family conflict. He covered all costs. He said out loud, into the microphone, 6 months of driving past the cemetery is 6 months of a grief that hasn't had permission to land. We're going to give it permission. He turned to the competing family, the Mensa family from Atlanta, and their matriarch, a woman named Aqua, who was 68 years old and had been sitting with her hands folded in her lap since Abina began speaking, crossed the stage without being asked, and sat beside Abina on those steps. She did not speak for a moment. Then she said, "I know this road. The road past the cemetery. I drove it too. You will go in when you are ready, and when you go in, he will have been waiting." Both families received the full $25,000 prize. The audience rose. Steve Harvey looked at Abina, at Akua beside her, at the camera, and said, 5 words. "She belongs there. Always did." He said it the way a door is opened. When the episode aired 7 weeks later, the detail of the morning drive, 6 months, the same route, the cemetery on Peach Street, became the image that circulated most widely. It reached 315 million views in 12 days. The hashtag #SheBelongs. There was used by widows, estranged family members, grief counselors, and anyone who had ever been told there was no seat for them at a table they had earned. Family law advocates cited the estate attorney's live comments in discussions about marital property rights. Several funeral homes updated their spousal notification policies after the episode aired. 3 months after the taping, Abena Kwarteng walked through the cemetery gates on Peach Street. It was a Sunday morning. She brought Pearl. She brought flowers Joseph had liked, yellow chrysanthemums, because he had always put them in the kitchen window. She stood at his grave for 40 minutes. She said everything she had been holding since the Tuesday evening in March. She said his name out loud for the first time since the phone call from the hospital. She drove a different route home. 6 months after the taping, the estate attorney had completed a full review of the marital assets. The Kwarteng family's attorney had withdrawn several claims that lacked legal standing. Abena retained full rights to the jointly owned property and a significant portion of the estate. The $14,000 request was not paid and was not legally enforceable. Adwoa and Abena have not spoken since. Emmanuel called once, briefly, to say he was sorry for how things had been handled. Abena said, "I hear you." She has not said more than that. She is not required to. A year after the taping, the Joseph Kwarteng Foundation, established through Steve Harvey's foundation, provides legal advocacy and grief support for surviving spouses who have been excluded from funeral arrangements or estate proceedings by the deceased's family of origin. In its first year, the foundation assisted more than 480 families. Its motto came from Steve's words on that stage. "She belongs there. Always did." Today, Abena Kwarteng takes a different route to work. She still drives past the cemetery sometimes, not because it is necessary, but because it is no longer something she is driving past. It is a place she has been, a place she belongs, a place where a man she loved for 16 years is buried, and where she stood on a Sunday morning with yellow chrysanthemums and said his name out loud, and where the gates were open when she arrived. The gates were always open. She just needed to know she was allowed through them. Steve Harvey said in an interview 6 months later, "Abena Kwarteng drove past her husband's cemetery every morning for 6 months because someone had told her there was no seat for her. I want everyone who has ever been told there is no seat for them to understand something. The table you built, the life you shared, the person you loved. Those are yours." A letter from an attorney does not change that. 16 years does not disappear because someone sent a letter. If this incredible story of a wife's quiet dignity, her long road past the cemetery, and the morning she finally walked through those gates, moved you, subscribe and share. Share it with someone who has been told there's no seat for them at a table they helped build. Have you ever chosen dignity when you could have chosen a fight? Share in the comments. Ring that notification bell for more moments that remind us who belongs where.